Hello and welcome. Today we have another RA Group webcast for you. And as it is Wednesday, we have another episode of our Wellness Wednesdays with our nutritionist Luxey. Today, she is telling us about healthy and sustainable diets. Now, over to you, Luxey.
Afternoon, everyone. So today, like Steph said, we're going to be looking a little about healthy and sustainable diets. It's definitely a hot topic, and I'm sure many of us have heard lots about sustainability and how that can be incorporated into our diets. But what exactly does that mean when we talk about a healthy and sustainable diet? Can both be delivered, and is it achievable? So we'll start by looking at what exactly the food production and environmental impacts actually have. So it won't come as any surprise, but just some interesting facts and figures. Then moving on to look at what exactly is a sustainable diet and what do we mean by that. And then looking at the nutrients to consider. So quite often, one of the biggest questions people do ask when they talk about sustainable diets and healthy diets in itself, actually, is there anything that I'm going to be missing? Are there things I should be paying attention to? And then finally, just some resources to share with you if you have any further interest and would like to do some further reading, just some great resources to look at. So if we start with the impact of basically all stages of food production. So this diagram, I think, is quite helpful. It shows more or less all the different stages from sort of growing, harvesting, right through to when the products actually reach the retail environment and actually our purchasing behaviour. And just some call out stats in regards to what impact does what impact do all these stages have on food production. And as you can see, it won't come as any surprise the impact we are having on deforestation, the biodiversity or the loss of biodiversity, water use and how much we account for it, as well as overfishing and poor fishing practices, and how in fact overall the environmental impact on the ecosystem through greenhouse gas emissions and everything else, what exactly that impact can have. So what can we do, I suppose, when we talk about what does a sustainable diet mean? So more often than not, when you say what does sustainable mean to you in terms of a diet, these are probably the top things that come across. So looking at reducing your food waste, your food packaging, eating more plants, eating less dairy and meat, and sustainably sourced fish, as well as environmentally friendly food production methods. These are probably the key things I'd say that are kind of what people do associate with a sustainable diet, and probably the basis of which a lot of the research, the Eat Lancet report, the government guidance on what would be a sustainable diet possibly focuses on. And you can see in that diagram there, it just shows what would that look like if you just took a typical meal such as your traditional spaghetti bolognese that could be made with 100% beef mince. And if you were to look to make it slightly more sustainable and also healthier, you could possibly reduce that quantity of beef mince down to 50% and use 50% beans and pulses. So increasing your plant content and possibly serving it with another portion of veg to help increase the sustainability of that dish, but equally how healthy it could be for you. So moving on to the One Blue Dot report. So the One Blue Dot report was created by the British Dietetic Association. So it was created to basically investigate, could a sustainable diet also achieve some of the health goals? So actually putting a health layer on top, if you like, of sustainability and the dietary recommendations. And what does that actually look like in terms of tangible advice that we can give to the public and everyone of what they can follow in their own diets? So the main things surrounding that, which will hopefully be familiar to many of us, is looking at your red meat consumption. So reducing your red meat consumption and trying to avoid processed meat. So even with reducing your red meat consumption, so the guidance is around 70 grams per person per day. So trying not to exceed that, and if you do, trying to reduce your actual allowance of how much you have across all day parts. And then the big focus being plant proteins. So trying to prioritize how beans, pulses, lentils, nuts and seeds, how they all actually make up your diet. So actually, is it a case of you might have these on occasion, they don't form the main sort of star of the show, if you like, of your dishes? And actually, how could you rejig some of the dishes that you prepare for yourself in your home and for others in your family to make sure that rebalance is created, and how you can actually increase that? And looking at fish, So trying to look at sustainable sources of fish, and also including your 1 portion of your oily fish a week as part of your 2 portions of fish. And then dairy. So with dairy, it's moderate dairy consumption. So if you are looking at dairy alternatives, and making sure that your nut-based milk alternatives are actually fortified. So where you are using alternatives, just being a bit savvy when you are shopping. Most of the major big brands already fortify with a number of the nutrients and minerals needed, but making sure it is calcium fortified. But it's worth just having a little shop around to make sure, if it is going to form a big part of your diet going forward, it has the necessary nutrients that you would obtain from actual cow's milk. Your starchy carbohydrates, so your potatoes, your breads, your pastas, your rices, recommending to actually move to whole grains. So this is where you want to try to go for the options of your starchy carbs, but opt for the whole grain option. So your wholemeal pastas, your brown breads, all of those types of different carbs you can incorporate. And then your fruit and veg, again, it's increasing this segment in particular, and probably by quite a considerable amount, I'd say, for generally speaking, for sort of public diet, it would be looking to try and incorporate more portions across each day part. So whether, if you're looking at breakfast, for example, a really easy way to incorporate that could be if you're someone who has cereal in the morning, or porridge, or even toast, trying to incorporate maybe slices of fruit on top. So it could quite easily be incorporated into porridge, any other cereals, or even have it on the side as well. And it's also worth mentioning, even 150 ml portion size of juice, for example, like orange juice, does also count towards your 1 of your 5 a day, but it's just bearing in mind it's that portion size. So as long as it is 150 ml portion, that's absolutely fine, but any more won't count towards your 5 a day target. And it's better to try and eat the whole pieces of fruit for the fibre too. And then from a sustainability perspective, in fruits and vegetables, trying to reduce the sort of air freighted, pre-packed and pre-prepared fruit and veg. So ideally trying to eat in season where you can make use of the seasonal produce. There's currently a really big campaign going on about seasonal vegetables, and actually trying to encourage people to try and buy in season, just given all the impact of food production and the decline in vegetable procurement at the moment across certain industries. It's trying to encourage people to could you actually eat in season, and learn what kind of ingredients you can use and what kind of dishes you could possibly make too. And also not to be afraid of tinned, canned, frozen. And I think, if anything, during this time, that's certainly something that a lot of people have changed their perception on, which is great, and can definitely carry through going forward. Portion control. So portion control is probably a really important one here, because all of this is all relative to the context in which you consume it and how big or small of a portion you have. So trying to reduce that animal protein and your dairy protein and dairy produce too. So where you do have a traditional meal where you do have some meat and dairy in your diet, that's absolutely fine. It's just about how you reduce those in proportion to increasing your plant proteins. And then trying to avoid those high fat, sugar, salt foods. It's really, I know it's very easy to say, but it's probably more challenging to actually commit to doing this particular step. But if you do actually consume some of these items in your diet, that's absolutely fine. But how often is it? Just reviewing, does it become very much on every single meal occasion, or how frequent are you consuming these items? And then hydration. So ideally, from a sustainability perspective, tap water is probably one of the most sustainable, as well as from a hydration perspective, best hydrating options. However, also going for unsweetened tea and coffee, ideally over soft drinks. So from a health perspective, it's the fact that no added sugars and any of the additional nutrients that might be harmful. Oh, I think we've got a question. Yes, Caroline?
Hi, Luxey. We've just got a question come through from Gavin that says, what is Luxey's thoughts around animal welfare standards, and is it healthier to eat free-range meat and eggs?
Good question. So from I guess in terms of the actual practices of in which you're actually obtaining your sort of meat and dairy, yeah, absolutely. Actually looking at the animal welfare standards is really important. From a From a nutritional perspective, I suppose, in terms of is there any difference nutritionally, there isn't a significant amount of research to show there is much difference between the two. So nutritionally, it's absolutely fine, depending on where you get it from. But from a sustainable, trying to strive for a healthy and sustainable diet, absolutely looking at exactly what is that procurement purchasing behaviour and what are the actual ethical standards that sit behind the produce that you're actually buying in. And I think now it's definitely a lot more transparent, and it's very clear customers definitely want to know where exactly their food is coming from, how is it sourced, and what exactly are the criteria and standards that sit behind it. So it's very much, I guess, down to the supplier to be quite transparent, but it's also very easy for a customer to actually do that research. So you could quite possibly and quite easily now find it going on to some of the regulatory boards. So if it's for fish, for example, you can definitely go on and check what types of fish are actually sustainably sourced. And if those aren't sustainable options within the country, then you can definitely see it against a rating. So some of the ratings are an MSC rating, for example, and you can definitely see actually farmed fish compared to some of the other options in which you can purchase them from supermarkets. Actually, what is the more sustainable option, and then tailor your actual diet according to that. And then finally, it's reducing food waste. And food waste is probably one of the biggest areas in which, from a sustainable diet perspective, there's definitely been a lot of momentum. There's been a lot of initiatives, and that's definitely helping to drive the reduction of food waste, given it's one of the biggest things that, from a food perspective, that needs to be tackled. There's been lots of resources. Everyone's probably quite familiar with Love Food, Hate Waste. They have amazing resources on there on what you can do with all sorts of things that you would normally traditionally perhaps dispose of, but actually what can you do with some of these items and how you can quite easily create them into lovely dishes. And I know we've also done a series of actually how do you create some delicious banana bread, for example, from some mouldy bananas. So definitely one to pay some time to, and also looking at trying to increase any food waste that can be possibly recycled as well. So all in all, the Blue Dot report more or less lists their recommendations to what it takes to sort of achieve a healthy and sustainable diet. And I guess moving on, how does this actually compare to what the actual UK government advice is on what our diets should consist of? So if you actually looked at the Eat Well guide, in comparison to the recommendations from the report, it's actually not that dissimilar. It's quite interesting that the Eat Well guide is traditionally, if you look at the actual quantities and proportions, is very much predominantly promoting somewhat of a plant-based diet. As you can see, sort of the dairy segments and the meat and other protein segments is significantly smaller. So it is in fact somewhat aligned to what the actual recommendations are. So it's interesting to think of it as if we were all trying to achieve, ultimately the Eat Well guide, it inevitably will basically be achieving a healthy, sustainable diet as well, in terms of what the recommendations are on how we would achieve this. So I think that's quite interesting. And one of the biggest things from this is, if as a UK population we did in fact eat in line with the Eat Well guide, some interesting sort of research published by the Carbon Trust, as well as a study looking at the health outcomes, shows what we could do in terms of the impact on the environment. So it could result in a 31% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, the water usage reduction, land use, and quite possibly could halve an individual's food-related CO2 emissions by 2050. So I think they are quite alarming numbers, and it just goes to show, actually, if we could get the nation to move towards adopting these healthier eating practices, which is easier said than done, I suppose, what could the possible environmental benefits be? But also, you can probably see in that small box there, what are the actual health implications? Because moving towards a healthy, sustainable diet can have amazing numbers of reductions in lots of different chronic diseases that can be modified by lifestyle. So reductions in coronary heart disease, stroke, different types of cancers, as well as diabetes. So it can save so much for the economy, as well as helping halve some of these numbers. So I think it just goes to show, actually, how can we adopt some of these practices in a sustainable way? I think we've got another question possibly.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, actually, Luxey, it's so true, actually, because I know a lot of people know, but I'm type 1 diabetic, and I did a Daphne course, which is dosage adjustment for insulin, for example, for different types of foods. And when I went on a pure plant-based diet, my blood sugar levels remained completely flat, like the same as they should. So it just goes to show that it can have a massive effect on sort of then my mental health's better, and there's like a knock-on effect. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
That's really interesting, actually. Thanks for sharing that, Caroline. I think it's quite interesting, especially given, like you say, in your particular condition with being insulin dependent, actually how it can have an impact. So no, that's quite interesting. I guess that kind of takes me on nicely to nutrients to consider. That probably is an area in which a lot of people initially sort of spark some kind of nervousness, anxiety of, well, actually, if I was to move to a plant-based diet, what about my protein levels or my iron? And it's just looking at actually, are these legitimate concerns? Should we be concerned about some of these nutrients? And should we be considering exactly what actually, how we get them in the diet if we were to move more towards a plant-based diet? And the biggest one, and one of the most popular ones, tends to be protein. So will we have enough protein if we were to move to a plant-based diet? And in short, the answer is yes. Your protein status and protein intake is not compromised. As a population, we are already exceeding our protein intake requirements. And fundamentally, if you're following a plant-based diet, as long as your energy requirements are met, protein will not be an issue. You will more or less cover the protein that you will need in terms of your intake. And it's probably more key here, it's about variety. So it's actually just being a bit more clever about the choices and your protein plant-based sources that you can use. So actually keeping it varied. So if you do have sort of beans, pulses, soya, things such as that in your diet that you are going to adopt, actually varying it. So trying not to consistently have the same plant-based protein source in your diet, but actually mixing it up. So perhaps pulses, beans, lentils, but try different pulses, try different types of beans. There's so many different variations out there. It might be comfortable to sort of stick to the safe ones that you know, red kidney beans, black-eyed beans, some of the more comfortable ones that everyone's quite familiar with, but try and venture out, try other types of beans and lentils like poi lentils, and there's all sorts of different types. And it's also very inexpensive to add many of these into your diet. So it's just a case of experimenting and quite possibly finding out the variations that work for you, but equally establishing recipes that are most probably going to become part of your sort of core diet and how that's going to fit into your lifestyle too. Looking at some of the other nutrients, so iron, calcium, zinc, iodine, vitamin B12 and omega-3. In iron, in terms of iron, red meat is probably the most, has the most abundance of the most bioavailable type of iron. And what that basically means is it's in the form in which your body can actually metabolize it and absorb it. So with iron, variety is key. So the plant-based sources can be things such as kale, baked beans, dried fruits, nuts. It's possible, but the fact is that it takes your body a bit longer to convert this into the iron format that you need it in your body. Not to say it's not achievable, absolutely is, but it's just being aware of actually the variety of different elements you should be incorporating. But if you are following a plant-based diet or slowly moving towards trying to encourage and eat more of these types of items, it will probably come naturally anyway, because you would be increasing your vegetable intake, for example, so you would have covered your iron requirement that you will need. Calcium is another one. So if, like I mentioned before, if you are using dairy alternatives, just making sure they are in fact fortified. Majority of them are, so you don't need to be worried as such, but if you're, depending on the types of brands you're using, or if you are looking at new products, just making sure, having a quick look at the label, most of them will state if they are in fact fortified. Soya is a great source of calcium too. Tofu, you've got broccoli, and also it's good to know that flour in the UK is in fact fortified with calcium. So it's one of those things of, if you are including and having a varied diet, again, there's no need to really worry about your calcium intake. Similar goes to zinc. Zinc is similar to iron in terms of how it's found in sources and how your body can metabolize. So things like tofu, different types of nuts and seeds. Iodine is another good one. So again, it's the fortification. So making sure the dairy alternatives are fortified, given that the majority of our iron, the main source in our diet is in fact dairy. So it's just being aware of where you're replacing that for dairy-free alternatives. Is it in fact fortified? And it's actually a nutrient of concern here in the UK. That's definitely a lot of research going into to try to get to a stage where we can actually have it fortified in some of the sort of national salt guidance, or actually having it within the food supply. We're not quite there yet, but it is something that's really vital. Iodine, a deficiency in iodine can have a detrimental effect in sort of neural tube defects. So that's when during sort of when babies are born and the fetus development and brain development, it has a really important function here to play with neurological development. So, which is why, as a nation, it's sort of in the public health interest of actually, can we look to get this into a fortification program, so that everyone will never have to worry about iron deficiency because it will be in the food supply. Vitamin B12. So this is probably one of the most important nutrients of concern and should be considered to be taken as a supplement if you completely remove meat and dairy from your diet. So there are some sources, so fortified breakfast cereals will have vitamin B12, things like Marmite, but you should probably consider taking a supplement if you are predominantly on a plant-only diet, I would say, where you don't have any inclusion of meat and dairy. And then you've got omega-3, and again, there are plant-based alternatives of these too, so different types of nuts and seeds. Again, it could be something you could consider if you did want to take a supplement of this instead, if you've completely removed fish from your diet as well. But I would say it's probably key here to stress, when we talk about a healthier, sustainable diet, we are still we are going on the assumption that some meat and dairy will still be included in the diet, which is why most of these nutrients should not be a concern. I think we've got a question. Yes, Caroline.
So Gavin's asked a question that I think we all would like to know the answer to, which is, can dark chocolate be considered as a sustainable source?
Gavin does love his dark chocolate, doesn't he? It seems to be making a regular feature.
He does.
So no, absolutely it can. And I guess it will depend on the cocoa and how that's been sort of like the ethical side of how, in fact, the farmers are being treated. But yeah, absolutely it can do. It just will depend on where that's come from, and of course the suppliers that's driven from too. But yes, you can still continue to have your dark chocolate, Gavin, as we all can too. But no, those are probably the most important sort of take homes, I'd say. There's so much more that goes into a sustainable and healthy diet, and I think it's such a fascinating, complex area that I think we'll continue to spend time coming back to, and actually how we can sort of incorporate a lot of this within our sort of recipe development. And something certainly we're focusing on with our Ways to Be Well program and a plant-based focus, and just how in fact we can take customers on that journey. I think there's definitely been a lot of research that customers are in fact taking this journey. Many are already quite well into this journey of having lots of things such as a meat-free day of the week, if not reducing meat to becoming more of a flexitarian where meat and dairy only feature on occasion. But there are still many people, I think, who traditionally may not consider meat-free options or increasing that plant-based protein element. So it's definitely trying to teach customers, but also take them on that journey through the food. So actually, how can we show some great options that you don't feel that you're lacking anything else? And so, yeah, I think that's covers everything we had in mind. I have just put some resources up here of, if anyone has any further interest in this area, it's such a fascinating space. Feel free to have a look at these resources. You can definitely read a lot more on there, lots of different measures, and exactly what kind of research really goes behind investigating what is a sustainable and healthy diet. I think we also have one more question possibly.
Yes, it's from myself actually, Luxey. So we talk about a sustainable diet, and for example, I think Weetabix is probably a good breakfast meal, but I have it every morning because it's easy. But then I do find I have problems such as I get bloated, or I just don't feel that great sometimes once I've eaten it. And is there something in that you shouldn't keep eating the same food, perhaps, even though they're healthy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's definitely key, especially in relation to sort of gut health, is variety. There's lots of research, and it's quite clear that the more variety from plant-based foods, a variety of different fruits and vegetables and grains, it can definitely help promote sort of good gut health. And you're completely right. It's very easy to get stuck into a routine, especially a diet routine, I'd say, of the same breakfast every single day, because like you say, it's a safe, easy option. But actually trying to vary that. So Weetabix absolutely is fine to have for breakfast, but pairing that perhaps with a piece of fruit and maybe a glass of milk or juice, and trying to sort of enhance what you're having, but also definitely mixing it up. I think that will definitely help in terms of contributing sort of to a diverse gut microbiome, which is definitely beneficial to help with your gut health, and hopefully could possibly help with some of those gut related symptoms you've experienced.
Lovely, thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Luxey. That's absolutely fascinating. And I can say I am very happy about the dark chocolate. So I can continue to eat it as long as it's fair trade, I guess, right?
That's right.
Meanwhile, for more information about our program of discussions, please go to RA Group's website at www.ragroup.co.uk/news to download the broadcast links. Meanwhile, if you have any questions or suggestions about how you can get involved, please do email gavin.goody@ragroup.co.uk. Thank you for joining us today. Have a fantastic afternoon, and we'll see you next week. Same time, same place.